everyone, welcome back to Liz Sews and the next video in my Disney Bounding in the Bedroom series. Today we're going to be focusing on Tiana. In the last video I showed you how I constructed this bra, and if you're interested in learning more about it, I'll link that video up in the iCards above. Today we're going to focus on the tap pants. Now originally when I made these plans I was expecting that I was going to use the Simplicity 8510 pattern. However, once I took the pattern tissue out and sort of examined it in more detail, I realized that the yoke that's on here is not an actual yoke. It's just sort of like appliqued on top of the regular base short pattern. And I have made this view previously and I just wasn't happy with the amount of flare that it had to it. So I decided that I was going to go ahead and draft my own tap pants instead. I did try to film the drafting of this pattern, but unfortunately I forgot to hit record. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little run through of the drafting process now, but I'm going to do it in miniaturized version just so you can get an idea of the steps that I followed. So the first thing I did when drafting is I took my natural waist measurement, because I do want the shorts to hit me on my natural waist. I took my natural waist measurement and divided it by 4 and drew sort of a curved line on my piece of paper. So let's say this is going to be the center front and this point here would be 1/4 of my waist. Next, I drew a straight line down, and I want the straight line to be equal to the distance of the short. So in the center front, I'm going to measure from my waist down to how long I want my shorts to be in the center front. And so in my case, let's say center front there and side there. So in my case, I wanted my center front seam in the front of the pants to be I think it was like 13 inches long, but you should just do it based on your own preferences and what it says on you. The next thing I did is measured 2 inches down from my waist, so that would be like my high hip, and I measured that circumference and divided it by 4. So, and then I measured down on my pattern piece 2 inches, let's say there-ish, and drew in a line coming from the center front, and the length of this line is going to be 1/4 of that high hip measurement. So let's say that one ended right there. So next we need to measure our side seam. So again, get your tape measure and measure from your waist down to the length you want it to be on your side. So in my case, I wanted my side to be 11 inches where my front was 13. I sort of liked the idea of the short, sort of like sloping upwards towards the sides. I thought that would be really cute. So then you want to connect a straight line going from your 1/4 inch waist, 1/4 inch high hip, and extending the length that you decided you wanted it to be. So like that. And then the last thing you need to do is connect the side seam point to your center front point. So now you should have sort of like a trapezoid that looks like this. So we need to decide where we want the yoke piece to sit. The reason that I measured 2 inches down from my waist, so this was the waist and this is the high hip. The reason I measured 2 inches down on there was because I wanted the side of my yoke to be 2 inches, but then I'm going to grade it out to a point in the center front. So again, take your tape measure and measure how long you want it to be from your waist to the bottom point of the yoke. So let's say I wanted my yoke to end right there. And then all you have to do is connect a straight line from the side seam to the point of your yoke, like that. So everything up here in this sort of triangle is going to be the yoke, and everything down here is going to be the leg. We're going to cut our yoke out on the fold, and we're going to cut out the leg piece on the fold. Once you've done that, you can cut apart your yoke and leg piece. So here we have the yoke and here we have the leg piece. Now at this point in time, I needed to add seam allowances. So I knew that I wanted the center front to be cut on the fold, but I needed seam allowances added to the top, the side seam, and this seam here. I also need seam allowances added to my leg piece along the side seam, this seam, and the hem. You don't need to add seam allowances on the 2 sides that are going to be cut on the fold. So let's pretend as if I'm adding my seam allowance to the top of that pant. So I would add seam allowances up along those 3 sides. Now, you could go ahead and make the pant just like this, but it's not going to have a whole lot of flare. And as I had mentioned, the whole reason I'm drafting it myself is because I wanted to get something that was a lot more voluminous along the pant section. So I'm actually going to slash and spread this and fan it out until it forms almost a quarter of a circle. So when I was doing mine originally, I think I slashed and spread it about like 8 times. You can do however many you want. Try to do them equidistant apart. And then we're going to take our scissors and we're going to cut up to, but not through, the seam line. And then I spread it apart because now I have all of these pivot points. And what I did is I aligned my side seam on the vertical section, and then I aligned my center front on the horizontal section like this. I'm just going to tape it down for now to make it easier. Like that. And then I just played around with all of my pieces on the inside until I got something that looked how I wanted it. So you sort of want to spread these equally apart. Like you don't want to spread one of them apart by a lot and then another one apart by not very much. So you want to try to keep it as equal as you can. It doesn't matter if it's not exact. And just sort of play around with those pivot points until you have something that forms a quarter of a circle. So something like that. So you can see how this, the side that I was going to cut on the fold is going horizontally, and the side that's going to be my side seam is going vertically, and I've sort of spread it out like this. Now, because we're using the seam line as our hinge point, it means that this distance here has not changed at all. It's going to be slightly shorter when on the cut line, but the actual seam line is the same distance as it was when it was attached to this yoke. And that's important for when we're easing it in on the construction process to make sure that this distance is still equal to this distance here. Once you've spread it apart, you can use a piece of tracing paper to get your finished leg pattern piece. So here is what my front pattern piece looks like here. You can see my vertical line and my horizontal line. You see that gentle scooping motion. So all you're really doing is laying a piece of paper over top and then sort of, filling in the gaps where you've spread apart here along the bottom. And that's going to be your leg. Now I went ahead and did this same exact procedure for the front and the back of the pattern. The reason being I did want my back to be slightly longer just to go around the rump and stuff like that. But it was the same process of, a quarter of the waist, a quarter of the hip, distances, forming your yoke and spreading everything apart like this. So front and back, and you get all of your pattern pieces. So I should have a front and a back leg piece like this. You'll have a front and back yoke piece like this. And then the last thing we need to draft is the gusset. Because if we were just to use the yoke and this leg piece, what we'd end up with is a circle skirt. And a circle skirt is not tap pants. So for the gusset, you need to determine how long you want your gusset to be. In my instance, I think I started out with 10 inches, and then once I made up a test version, I decided that it really needed to be 8 inches instead. So I don't know how to decide how long your gusset should be. I just know that once I made it up, then I knew what that I needed. So I drew a line that's going to be the gusset length. And then going off of that line at a 45-degree angle, we want to draw 2 sides of your gusset. So like this and this. So the sides of mine are 3.5 inches. And I'm going to do that on both sides of my gusset. like that. And then lastly, I just connected those two sides with a gentle curve. Like this. And here you can see what my finished gusset pattern piece looks like. And down here in the center where I decided I need to shorten it by 2 inches, that's why you see that little bit of an overlap there. So that's going to be my gusset piece. So when you're cutting out your tap pants, you should have a yoke, front and back, so 2 yokes, and 2 legs, front and back, because these legs are, all of these are being cut on the fold, so your legs should end up forming a half circle in the front and a half circle in the back. So now that I have my pattern all ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and cut it out in the silk charmeuse, and I'm going to come back to you to show you the construction method for my tap pants. Okay, so the charmeuse has been cut out. This is such a lovely fabric. Never worked with something like this before, but it just looks so liquid. I love it so much. So I am decided to use the So Fine thread on it because I needed to use a much smaller needle. So I'm actually going to go with the 6080 Microtex needle, and so I needed a much smaller thread because that needle has a smaller aperture or opening in it. So a 68 needle and the So Fine thread, and I did some testing on my machine with just some scrap pieces, and I ended up going down to, I think it's a 0. Yeah, I set the tension dial to 0 on the machine, and that seemed to be okay. There's still just a teeny bit amount of puckering, but I think that it's enough that when you press it, I mean, it's not enough so that when you press it, you know, you won't really see anything there. So I got my machine all dialed up, thread, needles, all of those things figured out, and so I can start sewing the actual garment. So I'm going to do the front first, and the front and back are constructed in the same manner. So here we can see what the front piece looks like once it's all cut out like this. So I'm going to stay stitch. I gave myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to stay stitch like just inside of a 1/2 inch all along this sort of piece here, and then I can clip it, and that will help me be able to set the panel into the top of the pants. So stay stitching is first. Okay, so now that is all stay stitch into place, I'm going to clip along this curve, so clipping into this, not past that stitching line. So that's going to be my stay stitching, and then that should help me to be able to get the point of this guy in there a lot easier. So now I'm just going to clip. So now I can spread this apart so it's kind of like one continuous line. And I can pin my point on here. I'm not very good at these points, but of course I did it twice when I was doing my mock-up, so I have a little bit of practice under my belt. So using silk pins, I'm going to pin at both sides and then ease the rest of that into place. So now I've got the 2 sides of the legs pinned into place. So when I'm doing this, I'm going to sew at my 1/2 inch seam allowance up to this point here, sink my needle, rotate the project, and then keep going along the other side there to get that nice inset triangle. Okay, and so here's the inside once that's sewn on. And from the outside, my point isn't perfect, but I think it's close enough. So I'm going to overlock the edges of the inside and then top stitch the point down in place. And I think once I do all that, it's gonna be sitting pretty nice and flat. But before I do all of that, I'm gonna go ahead and repeat these steps for the back half of the tap pants. Okay, so here I have the back and the front done. Once I had sewn both of those together, I went in with my overlocker and finished off this edge here, and then I top stitched it from the right side just to make sure everything was lying flat. And I'm pretty happy with how that's turning out so far. So the next step we need to do is actually turn this, what would be, you know, basically a circle skirt. And I'm going to turn it into shorts. So what I'm going to do is find the center front of this guy. I'm going to do it from the inside. So obviously the center front is just, you know, directly below the point in my triangle. And then I'm going to draw up a line that's 3 inches. So 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to mark 1/4 inch on each side of that line here at the bottom. And then I'm going to turn it into a triangle, bringing that 1/4 inch mark up to the top of that point. So I'm going to do the same thing on the back, and then I'm going to stay stitch this on that triangle line using really small, tiny stitches. Okay, so now that I've stitched up the sides of those triangles, cut off my thread tails, I'm going to cut up the center of it, sort of as close as I can get to the very tippy point. Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and set the gusset piece into that triangle just like we did the yoke piece. I found what worked the best for me is to pin one side, and then once I got to the rotating on this guy, I just did it without any pins, and that seemed to work out better for me. So that's what I'm going to do this time. So I'm pinning the edge of my triangle, or the edge of my gusset in, right sides together, just along one side. And just like we did with the yoke, it's going to be stitching to the very tippy point, then rotating my project around so that I can sew up the other side of this. I'm going to do that for both the front, and then the other side is going to connect to the back of the tap pants. So once the gusset is installed, it should look like this. Now, mine's not perfect, and I'm okay with that. I'm still learning. Obviously, this is like the first couple of times I've done this sort of sewing technique, but I think it looks okay, and I'm still excited about the project. So the gusset is really what turns the circle skirt into a short. So now we can go ahead and do up the side seams. But I'm going to leave one side open for about 6 inches, and that's going to be where I'm going to put my button closure in so that I can get the shorts on and off. Ideally, I would have liked to have done these sides in a French seam, but I forgot to add extra seam allowance for that, so I'm just going to do what I've done for the rest of this area, which is sew it together and then hit it with my overlocker and top stitch it down. So this other side, I'm fine to pin it all the way down because this one's going to be fully closed. In my concept drawing, I did have buttons on both sides, but I think I'm just going to leave buttons at one side because the placket is kind of hard to do and it adds a lot of bulk. So I think I'm just going to do closures at one side, and then I might decide once I put it on that I want to just add some faux buttons to the second side so that it looks more symmetrical. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to sew up those side seams. Okay, side seams are done. I decided not to top stitch them, but I did finish them with some overlock just to keep everything from fraying. So now I need to go ahead and finish the side here. So when I sewed up the side seam, I stopped at that 6 inches below. Then I cut in and overlocked just the bottom portion that was sewn, and then I have this upper portion here which remains unsewn. And so what I'm going to do on this guy is put in a continuous placket. So I cut a piece of silk that's like 3 inches by 14 inches, I say. And I am going to sew it onto this guy with a 1/2 inch seam allowance because that's what I've allowed myself, and just sort of go this way and jump that little point where the two sides come apart and go across that way. So now that's been sewn on at 1/2 inch, and I'm going to probably press this down a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is take this free edge of the placket, fold it in so it's touching that seam allowance, and then folding it in again so that it covers up all of my raw edges, and then I'll edge stitch from the outside to form my placket. Okay, so all of the seam allowances pushed that way, and then on the raw edge I folded it in so that it's touching the seam allowance and pressed that in. So then the final step is to just fold it, and I want the folded edge of this side to just go over my stitching line down here, so that when I edge stitch from the outside, it'll go ahead and catch that. So I'm just going to pin this placket into place. I will say the silk is proving to be a little bit more challenging to work with than my tester fabric. I'm getting there, but this is very slinky, but I hope that means it'll be very comfortable to wear as well. Sometimes you just have to make those trade-offs of a harder fabric to work with, but it feels a lot nicer. See. Okay, so that's all been pinned into place. That's what it's going to look like from the right side, and from the inside it's covering up all of that raw edges. So I'm just going to stitch in the ditch there to secure the placket in place. Okay, so now that placket has been secured into place, and what it looks like on the inside. So the last thing I need to do on this placket is angle it out. Oh, we can get rid of the excess here up at the top. So the way that I want this placket to sit is that the back, you'll see it just like that, but on the front it'll be folded along to the inside so that once you button it up it'll still look like a continuous seam. So when you button it up, the seam will look more continuous. So all I need to do is, when it's folded in half on the inside, one way that I can keep it from continuing to roll outwards is just to stitch a straight line just across here, going sort of like at an angle so that that corner is sort of sewn off. So the straight line will go that way, and that will keep everything folded where it needs to be. And once you sew that little angled bit on the inside of the placket, that's what it should look like. So now I'm going to do the waistband, and I'm going to do it much in the similar way that I did this side placket here. So I just have long strips of silk. This is about 1.5 inches wide and long enough to go around the waist here. And what I'm going to do is sew it with right sides together onto the garment, and then I'm just going to flip it over, do a couple of folds, and so that everything is going to be clean edged and finished, and so you have a narrow waistband. Okay, so the waistband is now done. Really liking how that's turning out. So now I need to turn my eye to the bottom here and look at hemming. So I did 2 practice hems. So this one is a baby hem where you fold the fabric over, stitch it in place, then trim it, fold it again, and stitch it a second time. And I really like how that turned out. It's going to be really time consuming. The second option that I have is I sort of like cheated and did serge the side of this with the overlocker and then folded it twice. It makes the hem a lot heavier and not as floaty. So I think, even though this is going to take me forever, I'm going to do the baby hem. Wish me luck, and when I come back I'll have this fully hemmed. Whew. Finally finished it. I actually really love how the hem turned out. It does sort of lettuce just a tad because I was sewing on the bias. Of course, the edges of the circle are on the bias, but I think it's okay because of the style of tap pant that it is. It'll sort of like add to that flirty nature of it. But yeah, this is the first time I've ever done a baby hem, and I think it turned out pretty well. I do like how clean it looks on the finish. So the last step of finishing off these pants is, of course, adding my buttonholes and buttons. So I'm going to add the buttonholes to the front of the placket and some buttons down here so that I can get in and out of these pants, and they'll be finished, and I can show you the final reveal of my Tiana inspired lingerie set. I'm finished. So I ended up putting 3 pearlized buttons in here. I thought it sort of like lent themselves to that sort of vintage theme with it. And then I did do just a little like hook and eye up along the top of the waistband to make sure that that stays closed. But yeah, really happy with how these turned out. I think they look really fun and flirty, and they definitely have a lot more volume in the legs than the original pattern I was looking at. So I'm glad I took the time to go ahead and redraft it and have these new tap pants. But once I finished this setup, I realized it read more Tinkerbell than Tiana, but I still really like how it turned out. If I had it to do over again, I'd probably cut the yoke piece of the tap pants on the bias so that it hangs a little bit nicer. But you live and you learn. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and make sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell down below so you don't miss any of my new content. I'll see everyone next time. Take care.